Under the blinding spotlights of one of New York City's most prestigious fashion shows, cameras flashed like strobe lights as models swept down the runway in dresses that sparkled like liquid gold. The audience sat breathless, a mix of celebrities, critics, and buyers, all leaning forward as though a single blink might cost them a moment of genius. Backstage, frantic designers and assistants whispered urgently, taping seams and fixing hems while praying their collections would earn a standing ovation. It was a realm of elegance and ego, where a misplaced sequin could spark gossip for weeks. Amid the extravagant chaos, Marjorie Hale, a 67-year-old seamstress whose name had never appeared in a magazine, stood silently in the shadows, clutching the edge of a velvet curtain. She'd spent decades sewing for other people's dreams, hiding her own brilliance behind famous labels, never imagining she'd even glimpse the front row of a major show. Her heart pounded with a mix of pride and sorrow, because one of the gowns gracing the runway tonight bore her stitches, though no one would know it was hers. She watched each model intently, every bead and drape a silent tribute to her late husband, Peter, who'd always told her she was destined for more. As the next model turned the corner, the air seemed to shift, thick with an unseen tension, and in the very next instant, a flicker of orange fur appeared at the runway's edge, making the audience gasp in collective shock. You won't believe how this story ends. It's a twist that will touch even the hardest hearts and prove that sometimes the smallest creatures carry the weight of miracles waiting to unfold. The cat stepped into the blinding lights as if he belonged there, his ginger coat glowing like molten copper against the white runway. People froze mid-applause, hands half raised, eyes wide as the animal trotted forward with an eerie calm that felt almost rehearsed. His paws made no sound on the polished surface, weaving effortlessly between towering heels and billowing fabrics. One model nearly stumbled as she tried to sidestep him without breaking her pose, panic flashing in her eyes as beads threatened to scatter like rain. Security guards hovered at the edges, torn between lunging in and avoiding a scandalous scene that would ignite social media within seconds. The audience, suddenly transformed from jaded fashion insiders to open-mouthed spectators, leaned in closer, phones recording every step. Marjorie felt the blood drain from her face as she noticed that the cat wasn't just wandering aimlessly. Clenched gently between his teeth, something metallic glinted beneath the harsh stage lights. It swung back and forth, catching flashes of gold, silver, and red like a tiny beacon. For a second, the object seemed familiar, though the notion felt absurd in such an opulent setting. Earlier that day, Marjorie had awoken alone in her modest Bronx apartment, sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds onto the cluttered table littered with spools of thread and scraps of satin. She moved slowly through her routine, each motion feeling heavier since Peter's death, the silence pressing in like a weight she couldn't shake off. Coffee went cold in her cup as she replayed the dream she'd had of Peter standing beside her, urging her to keep sewing, keep creating, keep living. Work was her only refuge, and though her talent was undeniable, she'd accepted that the fashion world would never remember her name. Tonight was supposed to be her small, private victory, her gown on a world-class runway, even if no one knew it was hers. But as she watched the cat moving closer to the center of the stage, a chill traveled down her spine. The pendant dangling from his jaw glowed like a tiny flame, and suddenly, Marjorie's breath hitched as recognition struck her. It couldn't be possible. She'd lost that pendant months ago after Peter's funeral, convinced it was gone forever. Her hands trembled, gripping the velvet curtain tighter. How could it have ended up here, carried by a stray cat, under the blazing lights of Fashion Week? In the hush that fell over the audience, the cat finally paused at the very center of the runway, planting his paws firmly as though he were the show's true star. The pendant swung forward into the spotlight, catching every camera lens and illuminating an engraving that only Marjorie knew by heart, the initials M and P, a symbol of the life she and Peter had built together. For one wild, impossible moment, Marjorie felt as though Peter himself had sent this animal into her world to remind her that her story wasn't over. Around her, the fashion elite exchanged bewildered looks, whispering theories as security edged closer. A woman in the front row wiped away tears, overcome by a wave of emotion she didn't understand. Marjorie stepped forward before she could think, as if pulled by invisible threads. her eyes locked on the cat's. In that silent exchange, a spark of something ancient and powerful seemed to pass between them: grief, love, and a promise of hope. And as the cat slowly began to walk toward her, pendant still shining, the crowd held its collective breath, sensing that the true show had only just begun. Marjorie stood frozen as the cat approached her, weaving through layers of tulle and satin, the pendant still glinting like a star clutched between tiny teeth. Cameras swung in her direction, the audience shifting its focus from couture gowns to the trembling seamstress, who suddenly seemed more significant than any model on the stage. For a heartbeat, Marjorie felt exposed, as though the secrets of her entire life were being broadcast in high definition to the world. Security guards hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure whether to remove the animal, the woman, or both. Backstage, whispers erupted as assistants peeked out from behind curtains, desperate to know who this older woman was and why a cat had chosen her. The show's creative director barked into his headset, trying to keep the program moving, while realizing the entire event was spiraling into chaos. The cat, seemingly oblivious to the tension, paused at Marjorie's feet and gently dropped the pendant onto the polished floor. It landed with a faint metallic chime that seemed impossibly loud in the hush of the venue. Marjorie blinked rapidly as tears filled her eyes, staring down at the familiar curve of silver and the delicate chain she thought lost forever. For a second, she felt as though she might collapse right there on the runway. But what no one knew was that the pendant held more than sentimental value. Inside its hollow chamber, Peter had hidden a tiny flash drive containing the first sketches of the clothing line he and Marjorie had dreamed of creating together. The night he died, Peter had told her to protect those designs, believing they were her ticket to finally stepping out of the shadows. But in her grief, Marjorie had misplaced the pendant, convinced it was gone, and with it, the last piece of Peter's legacy. Now, staring at the pendant glinting under 1,000 lights, her heart pounded with a mix of hope and dread. Around her, murmurs rose into a wave of speculation as the cat sat beside the pendant, curling its tail protectively around it as though guarding a treasure. A young fashion journalist whispered that this was the most dramatic thing she'd ever seen. Meanwhile, a nearby model knelt carefully, offering her trembling hand toward the cat, only for it to hiss softly and scoot closer to Marjorie. For the first time all evening, Marjorie felt like the center of a story instead of a forgotten stitch in someone else's fabric. But as she stooped to pick up the pendant, a sharp voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stop her, that's evidence," shouted Roland Pierce, the notoriously ruthless head of security for the fashion event, striding toward Marjorie with determination blazing in his eyes. Roland was a man famous for maintaining iron control over every event he touched, and he'd been dealing with rumors of industrial espionage swirling around the fashion house for weeks. He'd been instructed to find the leak at any cost, and now he suspected this pendant might hold the stolen designs competitors had been dying to acquire. Two security guards lunged forward to intercept Marjorie, while cameras pivoted wildly, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The crowd gasped, torn between scandal and sympathy, as the elegant show morphed into something raw and unpredictable. Marjorie clutched the pendant to her chest, eyes wide with terror, struggling to understand how her private sorrow had erupted into such a public storm. The cat bristled at her feet, ears pinned back, its small body vibrating with a low growl that seemed too fierce for such a tiny creature. Marjorie's voice wavered as she tried to speak, but Roland cut her off, raising a hand as he barked into his radio. Everything she had kept buried for years was now threatening to spill out under the unforgiving glare of the runway lights. But deep inside, a new resolve began to crack through Marjorie's fear like sunlight through a storm. She straightened her back, feeling Peter's invisible hand on her shoulder, urging her not to give up the only thing that truly belonged to her. The pendant was more than a piece of jewelry. It was proof of her talent, her shared dreams, and the life she'd built and lost. The cat, as though sensing her decision, rubbed gently against her leg, purring with a soft, vibrating hum that seemed to lend her courage. Round them, the audience seemed caught between disbelief and awe, their expensive clothes and perfect hair suddenly irrelevant compared to the real-life drama unfolding. Marjorie took a deep breath, ignoring Roland's shouts, and lifted her chin as she declared that she would not surrender the pendant until someone explained why it was considered evidence. Her voice rang out with unexpected strength, silencing the chatter for a few precious seconds. The cat leapt into her arms, nestling against her chest as though sealing their alliance. And at that precise moment, Marjorie knew one truth with blazing clarity. She couldn't walk away anymore, not from her own story, and certainly not from the cat who'd become its unexpected hero. Roland stepped closer, his shoes echoing sharply on the glossy runway floor, face flushed with frustration as he jabbed a finger toward Marjorie and the pendant clutched to her chest. His voice dropped low and urgent as he explained that the fashion house had been under investigation for months, suspecting someone was leaking exclusive designs to rival labels overseas. Now he believed that Marjorie, the unknown seamstress, might somehow be at the center of it all. The audience, once eager for gowns and glamour, sat riveted in absolute silence, eyes wide and cameras rolling, desperate not to miss a single word of the unfolding scandal. Marjorie's mind spun as fear and disbelief crashed over her in waves, but the cat nestled deeper into her arms, its rhythmic purring vibrating against her ribs like a living talisman. Roland waved a security scanner over the pendant, and the device beeped faintly, confirming that something electronic was hidden inside. Gasps rippled through the front rows as the pendant was now officially labeled a piece of potential corporate espionage. Marjorie felt the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her shoulders, suddenly exposed in the cruelest spotlight of her life. Yet even as Roland ordered his team to confiscate the pendant, she felt a spark ignite within her. She realized this was her moment to finally claim the voice she'd kept silent for too long. Marjorie drew in a shuddering breath and raised her chin, her eyes glistening as she refused to release the pendant. The cat twisted around in her arms to face Roland, its small body tense, fur standing on end, emitting a soft, warning growl that made nearby security guards hesitate. The fashion crowd, people who'd once dismissed her as invisible, now stared with rapt attention, hanging on every trembling word. Marjorie's voice rang out as she explained that Peter, her late husband, had designed an entire clothing line just for her, a line so beautiful, so revolutionary, that he believed it could finally earn her name a place beside the giants of the industry. She revealed how Peter had hidden the sketches on the flash drive inside the pendant before he died, urging her to protect it from predatory corporations eager to exploit small designers. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she spoke, but she refused to lower her gaze. The cat let out a soft, plaintive cry as though echoing her heartbreak. Around them, designers, journalists, and influencers exchanged stunned glances, absorbing a revelation more powerful than any runway show. Even Roland seemed momentarily shaken, his voice faltering as he tried to regroup. For the first time, Marjorie felt the tides shifting in her favor, carried forward by courage she hadn't known she possessed. From backstage, a figure emerged, Lana DuPont, one of the show's head designers, known both for her creative genius and for guarding her brand with a ruthless, icy edge. Her heels clicked sharply as she crossed the runway, eyes narrowing as she examined Marjorie and the cat. But instead of the scorn or accusation Marjorie braced for, Lana reached out and gently touched the pendant, her expression softening as she whispered that she'd once been just like Marjorie, sewing anonymously in the shadows, terrified of dreaming too big. The audience inhaled sharply, sensing a dramatic shift in the room's energy. Lana turned to Roland and declared that the designs belonged to Marjorie and no one else, daring anyone to dispute it on live cameras. A ripple of applause spread through the venue as people realized they were witnessing not only a fashion spectacle, but a woman reclaiming her destiny. The cat blinked up at Lana and gave a tiny meow, earning a half laugh, half sob from the crowd. For the first time in years, Marjorie felt seen, not merely as a pair of hands behind a needle, but as an artist and a woman of worth. Even Roland lowered his hand, exhaling in resignation, realizing that pursuing Marjorie any further might turn public opinion completely against the brand. Then, in a moment that would replay in countless social media clips for weeks, Lana invited Marjorie and the cat to walk the runway together, pendant glimmering in the lights like a crown jewel. Models stepped aside as Marjorie moved forward, shoulders back, tears glistening on her cheeks, but her eyes blazing with newfound pride. The cat strutted beside her, tail held high, looking every bit like it belonged among sequins and silk. As they reached the end of the catwalk, applause erupted like thunder, echoing off marble walls and vibrating through the floor. Flashbulbs exploded as photographers scrambled to capture this collision of fashion and fate. Influencers shouted Marjorie's name, chanting it as if she'd been a legend all along. Backstage, staff wept openly, touched by a story that had reminded everyone why art and life can never be reduced to money alone. The pendant caught the spotlight one last time, scattering tiny rainbows over Marjorie's face, sealing the moment into history. And as the cat nuzzled her hand, Marjorie realized she hadn't merely recovered a pendant, she'd found the courage to step into the light at last. In the days that followed, Marjorie became an unlikely sensation. Her name splashed across fashion blogs, morning shows, and glossy magazine spreads that once ignored her existence. News anchors replayed the clip of her and the ginger cat striding down the runway, calling it the most human moment Fashion Week had ever seen. People everywhere were captivated by the story of the seamstress, who carried decades of grief and hidden talent, only to have it all unlocked by a stray cat and a lost pendant. Designers who'd never glanced at her twice now reached out with offers of collaboration, eager to align themselves with her authenticity and the emotional power of her designs. Meanwhile, the cat, quickly named Stitch by Marjorie, became a celebrity in his own right, his amber eyes and elegant walk turning him into a viral icon. Fans sent gifts and toys, and photos of Stitch lounging among bolts of fabric flooded social media. Yet despite the sudden fame, Marjorie kept her routines gentle and familiar, choosing to design in the quiet of her Bronx apartment, where Peter's memory still lingered in every corner. At night, she whispered secrets to Stitch as he curled at the foot of her bed, feeling closer to Peter than she had in years. Fame no longer frightened her because she finally knew her work and her story mattered. Each morning, Marjorie would open her windows and let sunlight flood her tiny sewing studio, the same space that had once felt like a prison of grief. Now, swatches of silk and sketches of new gowns lay scattered across her work table, a chaos that felt alive with possibility. Stitch often perched on a nearby stool, his tail flicking back and forth as he watched Marjorie thread her needles, as though offering silent creative input. Sometimes he'd gently bat at a spool of thread or curl up on a length of fabric destined for a couture dress. The soft weight of him in the room reminded Marjorie that miracles could arrive in the most unexpected forms. Small things, a purr, a flash of orange fur, the glint of silver in the sun, had become anchors pulling her forward. Customers and journalists visited her studio, eager to hear the story firsthand, always leaving with moist eyes and a vow to support her brand. Marjorie took care to mention Peter in every interview, crediting him for planting the seeds of her confidence. Stitch seemed to bask in the attention, though he remained fiercely loyal to Marjorie alone. The bond between woman and cat became a symbol of second chances, woven into every new design Marjorie created. Soon, Marjorie's name appeared on invitations to shows in Paris and Milan, but she insisted her debut collection would bear both her and Peter's names on the label. The fashion world buzzed about how an older, widowed seamstress had become the industry's new muse, sparking conversations about unsung talent and overlooked artisans. Magazines ran profiles about her journey from anonymous labor to creative force, highlighting how she'd fought to protect her late husband's designs from exploitation. People marveled at how a simple pendant and the cat who carried it had exposed greed and secrecy in the industry, while also reminding everyone of the real human stories hidden behind glamorous facades. Even Roland, the once skeptical head of security, issued a public apology, acknowledging Marjorie's courage and the injustice of trying to silence her. Meanwhile, Lana DuPont announced a foundation in Peter's name to support older artisans breaking into fashion. Marjorie attended the press conference, Stitch nestled in a designer carrier, looking thoroughly unimpressed by all the fuss. Though her days were now filled with interviews, contracts, and fittings, Marjorie always found time to slip away to a quiet corner, whispering thanks to Peter and stroking Stitch's silky fur. The world felt enormous and welcoming again. In the end, Marjorie didn't just reclaim a pendant, she reclaimed her place in the world, forging a new life where love, art, and resilience intertwined. She and Stitch built routines that blended quiet creative hours with bursts of newfound celebrity, balancing the noise of public adoration with private moments of gentle peace. At charity events, Marjorie often shared her story, holding up the pendant as a reminder that sometimes the smallest objects hold the weight of entire lives. People who'd once felt invisible found themselves inspired by her courage, determined to pursue dreams they'd long buried under fear or sorrow. And each time Marjorie stood before an audience, she thought of Peter, certain he was somewhere close smiling. The fashion world would never be the same, forever marked by the night a cat interrupted a runway and returned a widow's lost hope. Stitch remained by her side, purring softly as though weaving invisible threads between past and future. And as Marjorie often said with tears in her eyes during interviews, he didn't just save a pendant or a fashion show. He saved me, and together we created something beautiful out of loss.